Our guest today is Rob Main. He's the managing partner and chief operating officer for Sustainable Governance Partners. He's based in the Philadelphia area. He spent 20 years at Vanguard, the last 4 as head of investment stewardship for the Americas and Asia. We're going to talk about the state of play for shareholder engagement this proxy season. I'm Brock Romanek. Rob, the state of play for shareholder engagement. We're coming into another crazy proxy season. Every proxy season's been crazy now for, 15 years, but it seemed to be crazier and crazier every single year. And of course, the pandemic is no exception. We're into the second proxy season with that. So putting on your investor hat that you know so very well, what do you see to be the primary shareholder engagement topics coming into this proxy season?
Absolutely, Brock. And again, first, thanks for having me. It's great to see you. So, let's talk about company engagement. We call this period sort of the age of ESG, as environmental and social topics are becoming much more front and center for investors. But I even think before we look to the future or even today, I think you have to step back a little bit. And I think you and I well know that this field used topics. It was about the board, it was about shareholder rights, and it was about executive compensation. And if I think back to my investor days, if there was a tech company that had executive pay issues, that was the focus. If there was a shareholder rights issue at a REIT, that was the issue we jumped on. Or if there had been a company where a board had been a little slow to evolve, that became an issue that was under the microscope. But the focus was governance. And a lot of the activity, including engagement, was sort of tactical in nature, but focused on those governance issues. I think today, things have changed. Those topics, those traditional governance topics, remain foundational to companies' long-term success. But now investors are locked in on sustainability. And they're looking at E&S topics in greater depth than they ever have before. And this applies to both traditional active managers who are looking for new and different sources of alpha, but it also applies to the big index shops as well as they expand their stewardship programs to ensure they're focused on the right issues. So let me give you a couple examples of conversations I've had recently. One, I talked to a senior stewardship leader at a firm, and I said, so guys, what are you prioritizing right now? And his response was short and sweet. It was environmental and social topics for companies where they believe there is an impact or potential impact on long-term value creation. That the day we talked, he was planning to talk to an energy company about climate risk, and he was going to talk to a consumer company about human capital. That company, they continue to expect good governance, but increasingly they're using their limited engagement time on environmental and social topics. The other example I'd highlight would be, just look at what's happening at BlackRock. So BlackRock is now really opening up the playbook, and they're now more willing to use everything at their disposal to nudge companies towards being more sustainable. So that means more engagement, deeper engagement. It means more votes potentially against directors, more support for shareholder proposals, and continuing a trend we've seen from BlackRock in recent years, an increased level of transparency. So I think at a high level, what this means for companies is that they need to have the right people engaging with their investors. They need to be willing to disclose decision-relevant environmental and social information. And I think where the puck is going is that they're going to need to integrate relevant ESG issues into long-term strategy in a way that's different than anything they've done historically.
Yeah, I just taped a panel with 4 other people about how to handle shareholder engagement, and that's what they were saying too. It's all E&S all the time. It's really such a dramatic shift from just like 2 or 3 years ago. So when you say E&S is in focus, what do you think are the most highest priorities for institutional investors right now?
Yeah, so let's zero in on what's at the top of the list. part of what I do all the time is talk to institutional investors and talk to companies, talk to our clients, and talk to others across the ESG ecosystem. And there's really three priorities that are at the top of the list for almost every investor. We call them sort of the three C's. So it's COVID, it's climate, and it's human capital. So if you spend a minute thinking about COVID, look, this is an important topic for everyone right now, and investors are no different. And what they're focused on are sort of a plethora of issues, but it really zeroes in on a couple key things. Number one, they want to understand how the company has been impacted by COVID. They want to appreciate the company's response. So what have they done? They want to understand that response for both the business, but also for the people. They want to understand board oversight. And in some cases, they want to dig into any impact on executive compensation. So there's a lot there. In terms of best practice, an example I saw recently, a company I believe really nailed it. They provided rich details on the business impact and how the company planned to mitigate that, both short-term as well as long-term. The company detailed the impact on employees and other key stakeholders and gave the investor a good sense of both reactive and proactive measures they had taken. And then they also dug into the board. So they talked about the board's oversight. They talked about specific committees that were kind of taking on a leadership role. And in the course of the engagement, they also shared some sort of lessons learned from their experience. But I think the bottom line is investors just want transparency. They want to better appreciate what's happened near term. But for many of the strategic long-term investors, they're much more focused on how will this impact the business as we look out over the next several years.
Yeah, you're telling a story, but not only are you telling a story about how your business is looking outwards, like you mentioned, it's looking inwards as well as the employees, human capital, so important these days. And so it's a much more complex, layered story than I think companies used to tell, because there is almost like a 360 nature to it. So when it comes to COVID, what kind of, how much detail are investors typically looking for?
Yeah, so I think they want to, they want an appreciation of where the company has been. So they definitely want an appreciation of what has the experience been like in 2020. But again, more of the thrust of the conversation is more on the future. So how has the company responded, and how is that going to impact the business over the long term? And again, if they can capture both sort of the impact on the business and on the people, and give investors a good sense also of how the board has taken its oversight responsibilities really seriously, I think that's going to put the company in a very good standing with those key investors.
And of course, you have to be accurate. You can't be misleading. The SEC recently publicly announced its first enforcement action against Cheesecake Factory. And so, if you're wondering what facts might look like for misleading disclosure, you might want to go look at that case up on the SEC's website. So you mentioned climate sustainability. It already feels like old hat, but of course, and it's the most important topic still, and will probably remain so for the rest of our lifetimes. What is engagement looking like there?
Yeah, I mean, look, climate's a top issue across the board for investors. I do think, though, it's sort of moved into a sort of a new phase of engagement. I might call it sort of goals and progress. So companies are under pretty intense pressure to enhance their disclosure, to have goals to reduce or eliminate emissions. And I think importantly, they're also expected to have concrete details of how they're going to reach those goals. And I think, interestingly, if you look back a couple years ago, this was maybe confined to oil and gas companies. I think the interesting part today is it's not just confined to the energy patch anymore. You look at a company like a Barclays. So Barclays faced intense pressure from investors to curb its emissions and adjust its lending practices. So what did it do? It recently announced its ambition to be net zero by 2050. Included in that pledge It's a commitment to align all of its financing activities in line with Paris. It committed to reduce the emissions across sort of its power portfolio, and to create transparency and accountability. It's now making public a climate dashboard of the progress that they're making. So again, this is just one example, but we've seen a similar story play out across different industries for different companies.
So what about shareholder engagement on climate? It's been evolving, as I understand. Where does that stand? How can companies best prepare for that type of engagement?
Yeah, I think looking forward, what we expect is this is going to continue to be a top priority for investors. So investors will continue to turn up the dial on this topic. So we would expect to see more investor pressure, more net zero commitments from companies, and again, probably across different industries, and a continued focus from global stakeholders on this topic. Look, I think, Brock, we're in the early innings here. I think, as you mentioned earlier, this is an issue that'll probably be with us for the rest of our lifetimes. One thing, though, I'm hearing from investors is now that they're seeing companies make commitments and sort of set a pathway to achieving those long-term goals, this is where the real work begins. And so we're now going to move into a phase where there was goals, there's a pathway to get there, and now investors are going to be very focused on tracking that long-term progress. I think pulling it back to engagement for companies, they should expect questions on climate risk. They should expect questions from investors on how it's being managed. And I think really importantly, if a company has taken the step of providing more substantial disclosure, they've maybe even taken the step of producing a climate report or something that talks about that goal of net zero, then you better expect that investors are going to ask a lot of questions on that topic. And therefore, it's important that you have the right team in place for that engagement in order to handle those investor questions. So that probably means a mix of experts on the executive side, coupled with directors, so that they can give investors a better sense of how that oversight process is actually really happening.
Great stuff. And then when it comes to human capital, we have a new SEC disclosure requirement. We have enhanced investor interest. And so we have a lot more dialogue, it seems like, this proxy season about this topic. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I would echo all those comments there. I think the events of 2020 have only accelerated the focus on diversity, equity, inclusion from investors. I mean, I think there's a group of investors that have historically focused on human capital, but I think for a lot of investors, 2020 was really pivotal. And now they are laser focused on human capital. And, I mentioned earlier climate being about sort of goals and progress. I think human capital, though, is still in a disclosure phase. So it's in a phase where investors are asking companies to sort of tell me more. A lot of investors at this point are looking for more information. They're looking for more data. So I do think the onus is on companies to provide more disclosure so that stakeholders and investors can better appreciate how the company is managing its people and the diversity of its workforce. And as you mentioned, this is not just an investor issue. This is one issue, obviously, where there's a lot of stakeholders. You mentioned the SEC. We've also seen pressure from California. California's coming out with a new law focused on employee pay data. But we've also seen this topic pop up just in sort of normal business operations, sort of things you might expect along the supply chain, where supply chain partners are actually holding each other accountable to produce better data when it comes to diversity. So this is not just an issue of investors, it's not just the SEC, it's not just the states. This clearly is an issue that is being focused on by a wide variety of different stakeholders. But again, I think the theme that runs through all of it is this focus on a greater level of disclosure.
Yeah, it could impact your potential employees, the people that might be or may not be interested in coming to work for you, of course, potential customers. But when it comes to disclosure, some companies are being careful because there have been some proxy disclosure lawsuits. So when you're telling your story, you want to tell you an accurate story, so you don't get caught up in that trap. So for companies that might be hesitant to release their EEO-1 data or might provide otherwise more detailed disclosure in this area, what are you hearing about that?
Yeah, so I think, pulling it back to sort of the investor lane, I think I'd first tell you that it sounds like investors are using a wide variety of different tactics to encourage companies to produce more disclosure. So it's engagement, it's shareholder proposals, it's voting in support of financially relevant shareholder proposals, and there's also going to be the public campaigns, like the one from the New York City Comptroller. So we've seen companies, a wide variety of companies come out and commit to providing more extensive disclosure. What we recommend, though, for companies is it is going to be a case-by-case decision. And I do think for companies, it's really important for them to look internally first to better appreciate their current programs, their current priorities, and how this lines up with their long-term strategy. But we don't believe that the investor pressure on this topic is going away anytime soon. So really our ultimate guidance to companies is, be transparent, own the narrative, and set goals that are aligned with the long-term company strategy. But I think really importantly, and again, you can appreciate this, it just has to be authentic. But again, I think the bottom line here on this topic is it has really come to the forefront in 2020, but it's a topic we believe that's going to be enduring in its focus for years to come.
Yeah, in my neighborhood, every other house still has a Black Lives Matters placard in their yard, just like we do. So it's a huge issue here. So congratulations on forming a venture during the pandemic. I've coined a term for, I guess, we're brethren, the companies born during the pandemic. So this would be the CBP, companies born during the pandemic. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Brock. It was great seeing you.
CBP.